So it was a really interesting scene that was setting up a lot of dynamics and very focused on these four siblings who are clearly super bonded to each other. So I'm curious, as you were writing this series, how much did you develop those characters before you even started writing so that you could?
I knew that I wanted to have this really strong makeshift family bond. And when I started, I did do a lot of planning in the beginning that I was going to have four siblings. They were all going to be slightly different from each other. They weren't necessarily blood relatives, but they had these experiences that tightly bonded them together. So that was actually all kind of formed in my head and really messily written down on paper before I actually started any of the stories. But I did start with book one with Jack, but I will say I spent a lot of time thinking through that.
Yeah, they're all very clearly defined, even in this one scene. So I can imagine that throughout the series, it becomes a very rewarding payoff to see all the different siblings having their storylines.
That's the goal.
So I'm curious, you chose to write this series. There are a couple of choices I'm curious about. One is America versus Britain. What inspired you to write some American heroes and heroines coming to Britain?
So it'll come more out in the book, but I needed Jack to be away from England for a significant part of his life. So that'll be explained further on in the book. So there were a lot of different options with that, but I liked the idea of him growing up on the East Coast in the United States. I didn't want it to be New York, and then I kind of stumbled across actually an old map of Philadelphia and just kind of fell in love with that. And more of their upbringing in the other book will be explained in the other books. But Philadelphia was just a place I happened to come across that I really thought this is the place for them to grow up. So, and there's great maps of Philadelphia in 1840, by the way.
Yeah. And so what made you choose the early Victorian period?
I love this time period for a variety of reasons, but I think a lot of the world is really on the cusp of some major changes. You talk about the changes in ships, the invention of the railroad is kind of in the very beginning stages, not the beginning, but closer to the beginning. In book four, I talk about the invention of the telegraph. It's just a time when there's so much change going on. It's really fun to kind of weave that into the stories.
Yeah, that makes sense. And clearly you do a lot of research. How do you approach research versus writing? Does one come before the other, or is it kind of interwoven?
I thought it would be before I started writing, but that's not necessarily the case. I tend to research as I go. Like I knew that I wanted them to own a passenger vessel company. So as I was actually writing the first couple chapters and even the one I read, I was doing a lot of research on what the inside of a ship looked like during that time period. What did a dining saloon look like and those types of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know I was reading about your next series that's coming out that's going to be focusing on women with their relics. You talked about how it's going to be
Mhm.
informed by relics. So I'm curious, how are you researching that? Like, are there specific relics you had in mind, or do you get to spend afternoons
Yeah,
looking through museums looking for appropriate relics?
I would say yes, but it'll be my second series, so I've learned a lot. And what I've done is kind of done more of an outline of what things will look like across. There'll be seven books in this one across all the books. But I know, for instance, in book two, that the leads of that book will be in Damascus for a period of time, and they'll be looking at like ancient writing and stuff like that. So I've spent some time researching. So I've got the basic plot points down, so for that one specifically, I've done a lot more research up front. I actually came up with a lot of that idea because I was able to go to London last year and very much enjoyed my time in some of the museums over there. And that's kind of where the first thoughts of that sprang up.
Yeah, that's really cool. Did you study history, or was history at all part of your life before you started writing historical romance?
Yeah, I have a degree in history, but up until like writing, I've really been more focused on the data in the data field and things like that. But I've always loved history. My actual bachelor's is in history. So research and things like that are things that I happen to enjoy. I'm definitely one of those people that goes down the research rabbit hole and wakes up or comes out of it 4 hours later. So I definitely love that part of it.
Yeah. Have you been on any interesting rabbit holes recently?
I think the most interesting one I've been on most recently is, like I said, this series talks a little bit about ship travel, but my first book in the Brazen Curator series, the leads of that are actually going to go on one of the first leisure cruises that ever existed, which is drastically different than how we see cruising today. You know, the luxuries we have now just didn't exist then. So I've been on a lot of rabbit holes of like scoping out different ships and things like that. I now have lots of old ships I would like to visit, which before I started this, I would have never ever wanted to do that. But now I would love it. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'd say that's the most recent one.
I
So,
can relate to that. I've been writing a sailor hero, and so I've been trying to learn more about like naval ships and British Regency. And when I first started, and
mm-hmm.
I was like, they're like frigate, brig, all these terms. I was like, I don't know
Yeah.
what that means. I'm so bored. And then as I was doing more research, I began to learn it. And then I happened to be in San Diego for a different reason. And I was like, wait a second, there's a tall ship. I have to go on. And then I was so excited.
Yeah.
I was like, who am I? All of a sudden, I care about ships.
Yeah. Yeah. The weird
um,
things you get excited about.